Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are really staring down one of the biggest, most powerful, and honestly least transparent industries out there, industrial meat production.
That's right. We're talking about this fundamental conflict, really, at the heart of how we eat today.
Yeah, this huge gap, right, between the incredibly cheap price you see on the shelf
Mm-hmm.
and the hidden costs, the moral costs, the environmental damage, the public health risks, stuff that's just systematically kept out of sight.
Exactly. That lack of transparency, that gap you mentioned, it's not an accident. It's sort of the operational genius, if you want to call it that, of the industrial food model.
Okay.
We're really zeroing in today on these concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFO.
Right, CAFOs.
And these places, they're designed for basically one thing,
Mm-hmm.
massive scale and efficiency. Which means the real price, the animal suffering, the ecological harm, the way it twists politics, it all gets pushed off the books.
Externalized.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to try and pull back that curtain a bit. Yeah. Hopefully deliver some of those aha moments, the kind that make you stop and really reevaluate what you thought you knew about cheap food.
Because the whole system, it kind of relies on us, the consumers, operating from, well, ignorance, doesn't it?
It does. We generally don't know where our food really comes from, what its true cost is.
And certainly not what the animals go through.
Definitely not. So we've gathered sources that detail not just the suffering, which is intense, but also the economic machinery, the political forces that drive this whole thing.
And you really have to understand those gears turning behind the scenes, I think, if you want to grasp the sort of ethical weight of eating meat on this scale today.
Absolutely.
So let's start right there at the source.
Yeah.
Let's dive into the hidden reality of confinement inside these operations.
Okay. So when we talk about modern meat, the first thing you have to wrap your head around is the scale. The sheer, almost unbelievable shift in scale that's happened in, less than a century?
It's staggering. It's not just that farms got bigger.
No, it's like the entire ecosystem of farming has been rewritten.
Think about that classic image we all have of the American farm, the little farmyard.
Right.
Well, our sources show that back in 1930, the average American chicken flock, it was tiny, just 23 birds.
23. That was it for most family farms.
That whole small-scale, spread-out model, it's completely gone, unrecognizable today.
Totally. Today, it's hyper-industrialized. I mean, just to give you a sense of the scale, there's one single county in the U.S., Sussex County in Delaware.
Okay.
That one county produces over 250 million broiler chickens every single year.
250 million from one county.
Yeah, that county alone puts out more than 10 million times the average flock size from the 1930s.
Wow. And that massive shift, that concentration, it immediately reveals the first kind of ethical compromise, doesn't it?
It really does, because to keep hundreds of millions of birds alive in these huge, often windowless sheds, well, it requires technology.
Right. These birds are crammed together. They can't really exercise. They don't get sunlight.
They're so far removed from anything natural that, honestly, without constant artificial help, they'd just die.
So the system itself requires intervention just for basic survival.
Precisely. Without the constant addition of vitamins A and D discovered relatively recently and now pumped into their feed, and without artificial incubators replacing mother hens, these incredibly crowded, deprived birds simply wouldn't make it. The whole system is built on technological life support. Really, not on providing a healthy natural environment. It's an efficiency model where you replace natural functions with chemicals and machines.
Okay, so if the chicken industry needs technology just to keep birds alive, what about pigs? The swine industry seems to rely on just ruthless acceleration.
That's a good way to put it. The entire environment is engineered purely for market efficiency. It's all designed to get those piglets to market weight, usually somewhere between 240 and 265 pounds, as fast as humanly possible.
And how fast are we talking?
Well, naturally, a piglet would nurse and wean from its mother around, say, 15 weeks. That gives its digestive system time to develop properly.
Makes sense.
But in a CFO, time is money. So factory farms speed this up dramatically. Usually they're weaned at 15 days.
Days, not weeks.
Days. And now, in the constant push for more efficiency, some places are pushing that down to just 12 days old.
12 days. That's biologically almost instantaneous weaning.
It is. And the speed itself, it creates the next problem. This super early weaning means the piglets just can't digest solid food properly yet.
So what happens?
They immediately get severe diarrhea. It's an industry-wide issue. And this biological problem then creates, yeah, it's a cheap byproduct from slaughterhouses. It's high in protein, used specifically to fatten them up really fast, but it has a nasty side effect.
Which is?
It actually damages the lining, the mucosa of their gastrointestinal tracts.
So the food itself harms them.
It can, yes, which then often requires even more medical intervention just to keep them gaining weight and, protect the profit margin.
It's just this closed, toxic loop. Damage the gut with speed and feed, then medicate the damage, all to hit that market weight faster.
Precisely. And on top of the diet issues, the conditions they're kept in are, well, profoundly unhygienic and incredibly cramped.
Yeah, you found that industry sort of slogan.
Right. It's almost cynical, but it guides the design. Overcrowding pigs pays.
Overcrowding pays. That really says it all, doesn't it?
It captures the sort of moral calculation of the system perfectly. The overcrowding isn't an accident, it's intentional. Piglets, especially early on, are often kept in these dense, stacked wire cages.
Stacked cages.
Yeah. Where the feces and urine from the pigs in the higher cages fall directly onto the animals down below.
Oh, that's grim.
It is. They live in this constant, inescapable filth and stress purely because the tiny extra profit from cramming in one more animal is calculated to outweigh the cost of the disease and suffering that it inevitably causes.
It just makes you wonder, if this is the reality for chicken and pork, our main meat sources, is egg production any better? Even if you try to find those so-called ethical alternatives.
Unfortunately, that ethical disconnect, it largely persists even in egg production. You look at the giant producers. Like there's a company called Mark Eggs, sells over $500 million in eggs a year.
Okay.
They have something like 24 million birds. And the vast, vast majority of those hens are kept in tightly packed cages, battery cages.
And what we found really frustrating was that even when you look at the alternative systems, the ones marketed as better, some pretty dubious practices are still almost universal, like beak trimming.
Yes, exactly. Beak trimming or debeaking. Even in free-range or organic operations, where you'd think the birds would be less stressed, almost all of them still have their beaks cut back, often painfully.
Why, if they have more space?
Well, it's done originally to prevent severe pecking and even cannibalism, which are behaviors brought on by the stress and crowding of intensive confinement. But the practice persists even in better systems because, frankly, the number of birds is often still high enough, the conditions still stressful enough, that the risk is there. It's a management tool.
So free range doesn't necessarily mean stress-free or free from painful procedures.
Not necessarily. And you see glimmers, maybe like organic hens might get outdoor access. That's a requirement. But even that promise often bumps up against reality.
Like the example from Colorado.
Right. Our sources mention dry Colorado summers. The standard might say outdoor access, but if there's a drought, the pasture can be totally depleted, just dirt or mud.
So the birds are technically outside, but they're not exactly grazing on lush green grass.
Often not. The label, the standard, can feel incredibly thin when faced with the environment and the scale they're still operating at.
It just keeps coming back to scale, doesn't it?
It really does.
Mm.
We have to remember that all these practices, the sped-up weaning, the drugs, the confinement, the beak trimming, they aren't accidents. They're deliberate business choices.
Mm.
And they're driven by the demand for massive scale, which brings us to the huge economic and political forces behind it all.
Yeah, the reality is if you want to understand the moral cost, you really do have to follow the money. And the sheer scale of animal suffering we've been talking about, it's directly driven by an equally massive global hunger for meat. An appetite that's just exploded since the mid-20th century.
The numbers are genuinely staggering. Think about this. In 1950, the entire world consumed just under 50 million tons of meat.
Okay, 50 million tons.
By 2010, just 60 years later, that number hit 280 million tons.
Whoa, that's more than a five-fold increase.
A five-fold increase globally. And consumption per person also nearly doubled in that time, going from about 38 pounds a year to nearly 88 pounds a year on average.
And what's fueling that massive jump?
It's pretty directly linked to rising incomes. As countries industrialize and get wealthier, and as already wealthy countries stay wealthy, people tend to eat more meat. It's seen as a sign of prosperity, and diets diversify towards more resource-heavy animal protein.
Which puts unbelievable pressure on the food system to churn out cheap meat really fast.
Exactly. And to meet that absolutely astronomical demand, the structure of the meat industry itself had to change radically. It had to consolidate. This created what our sources basically call the barons of food.
The barons of food. Sounds dramatic, but is it accurate?
I think it is, yeah. The concentration of power, Especially in meatpacking, it's a textbook example of how monopolies or near monopolies form.
Okay, so break that down. What did that consolidation look like?
Well, let's look at the numbers. Back in 1970, the top four meatpacking companies controlled about a fifth of the market, roughly 20%.
20%. Seems
Yeah.
reasonable, spread out.
Right. But today, that same top four, they control about 80% of the beef exchange. 80%.
Yeah.
And a huge majority of the overall meat market, too.
Yeah.
Pork, chicken, you name it.
80%.
Yeah.
That's a massive shift of power from potentially thousands of smaller players to just a handful of giants.
A radical shift. And the consequence of that consolidation,
Yeah.
it's brutal for the traditional farmer or rancher.
How so?
Because when just a few huge companies control all the processing plants and the distribution networks, they can dictate prices. They squeeze the producers mercilessly.
So the person actually raising the animals gets less and less of the final price.
Drastically less. The traditional rancher's share of the retail dollar you spend has fallen dramatically over the decades. They're basically trapped. They have to meet the scale requirements and accept the low prices set by these corporate giants, or they go out of business.
And you literally see this changing the landscape, right? The actual farms themselves.
You do. The traditional farming landscape is vanishing. Our sources point out that the number of really large farms, we're talking over 2,000 acres, has almost doubled in the last 25 years or so.
Doubled.
While at the same time, those essential mid-sized farms, the ones between maybe 100 and 999 acres, they've been cut by almost half.
Wow, so the middle is just disappearing.
It is. The whole model prioritizes sheer scale, volume, and cutting costs above everything else.
Yeah.
It just drives out smaller, often more diversified operations.
And that concentration of economic power, it inevitably leads to political power, right?
Mhm.
Which creates this really problematic situation within the U.S. government itself.
Oh, absolutely. It leads directly to this central, you could almost say toxic conflict of interest right inside the Department of Agriculture, the USDA.
Okay, explain that conflict.
Well, the USDA is caught in this fundamental contradiction. On one side, its job is to give us public health advice on nutrition, tell us what's healthy to eat.
Right, the food pyramid, my plate, all that.
Exactly. But on the other hand, the USDA is also legally mandated to actively promote the U.S. food industry. And today, promoting the food industry overwhelmingly means promoting the products of these giant factory farms.
So how can they possibly tell you to maybe eat less industrial meat for your health when their other job is to help sell more industrial meat around the world?
They can't.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah.
That political influence, which is bought and paid for through massive lobbying efforts and campaign donations by these powerful meatpacking firms, it results in critical failures to protect the public.
And this leads to that really startling fact about recalls.
Yes, get this. This should genuinely shock every single listener. The United States government cannot order a mandatory national recall of contaminated ground beef,
Yeah.
even if it's known to be potentially lethal.
I just have to pause on that again. That's unbelievable. We're talking about food that can kill people.
Yes.
The government can force a recall of defective baseball bats or maybe dangerous sneakers, things that might cause a relatively minor injury.
Right. Things that don't usually kill you.
But if there's ground beef out there contaminated with deadly E. coli 0157 or HE7, the government has to ask the company, negotiate with them, to please voluntarily remove it from the shelves. They can't order it.
It speaks volumes about where the real power lies, doesn't it? These huge food companies, they operate a lot like the tobacco industry did for decades.
How so?
They lobby Congress like crazy. They pressure the regulatory agencies like the USDA and FDA to go easy on enforcement. They fund their own research, and they co-opt experts to help sell their products, even when the science might be shaky or misleading.
They've essentially bought themselves protection from the kind of basic safety liability that applies to almost every other product you can buy.
Pretty much.
Uh.
And you see this influence not just in safety loopholes, but in the nutritional guidance itself. Think about dairy.
Okay, milk. It does a body good.
Right. We're constantly encouraged to consume dairy products, specifically for bone health, to prevent osteoporosis.
Yeah, calcium, vitamin D.
Yet, when you actually dig into the source material, the global data is really contradictory. Sources point out that in many parts of the world where milk just isn't a dietary staple, people often have less osteoporosis and fewer bone fractures than Americans do.
Really? Less?
Yes,
Huh.
which strongly suggests that the official nutritional guidance we get might be shaped less by unbiased public health science and more by the economic needs of the incredibly powerful dairy industry, much like the meat industry.
It all seems to loop back to economic imperatives driving policy.
It often does. And none of this, the scale, the consolidation, the political protection, none of this high-volume, low-cost meat production would even be possible without massive subsidies and inputs, especially cheap corn and cheap fossil fuels.
Ah, the input cycle.
Yeah, the whole industrial food chain basically runs on cheap energy and monoculture crops. It's heavily subsidized by the overproduction of corn.
Which is used for animal feed primarily.
Exactly. And growing all that corn is only possible because of cheap fossil fuels used to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizers.
Mm.
In a way, the system is selling us oil disguised as meat.
And water, too, right? The water cost is huge.
Alarmingly so. Industrial agriculture, especially for feed crops, relies heavily on drawing water from non-renewable sources, like those vast underground aquifers, the Ogala being the most famous example in the U.S.
Pumping ancient water reserves dry?
Essentially, yes. This irrigation fuels the overproduction of really water-intensive crops, often cash crops for export. And it allows the producers to completely ignore, to externalize, the long-term cost of depleting local water sources. That cost gets pushed onto the public and onto future generations.
So they maximize short-term profit by using up a finite resource faster than nature can possibly replace it.
That's the model. So the whole system, it seems perfectly engineered, doesn't it? To transfer the true costs, the animal suffering, the political failures, the environmental destruction, the resource depletion away from the corporate balance sheet and onto the ecosystem, onto taxpayers, onto public health budgets.
Which is precisely why the price tag at the supermarket stays so deceptively low.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's follow those externalized costs now out into the environment. Because the ecological footprint of this whole industrialized meat system is, well, it's massive and incredibly destructive.
It really is. The sheer volume of waste generated is just overwhelming. Let's go back to that example, the Delmarva Peninsula, that big poultry-producing area on the East Coast.
Right, where Sussex County is.
Exactly. Our sources confirm that nitrates, which come mainly from excess fertilizer running off fields where feed crops are grown, and also directly from poultry manure, they contaminate about 1/3 of all the agricultural groundwater in that region.
1/3. That's people's drinking water, potentially.
It often is, yeah.
Yeah.
Groundwater contamination on a huge regional scale.
And that pollution, it doesn't just stay put in the ground, does it?
No, absolutely not. All that excess nitrogen, both from fertilizers used on feed crops across the Midwest and from the vast manure lagoons that are part of these CAFOs, it washes into streams and rivers.
And eventually flows downstream.
Eventually flows downstream, particularly down the Mississippi River system, and ends up in the oceans, where it feeds these enormous algae blooms,
Which then die and decompose.
consuming all the oxygen in the water, creating these vast dead zones.
Like the one in the Gulf of Mexico.
Precisely. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is probably the most infamous example. It's essentially an underwater desert, starved of oxygen, unable to support most fish or other marine life. And its size fluctuates, but it can range anywhere from 7,000 to sometimes over 20,000 square miles.
20,000 square miles. That's like the size of West Virginia, basically dead underwater.
It's enormous, and it's a direct consequence of the way we produce food, especially meat, industrially. The convenience of cheap chicken and pork is literally suffocating huge parts of our oceans.
The environmental costs are just staggering. But if we connect the system back to global health, we run into maybe one of the most genuinely terrifying implications of the factory farm model, the antibiotic resistance crisis.
Yeah, this is the big one, potentially. It's an existential threat, and it's fundamentally driven by the scale of factory farming.
How does that link work exactly?
Well, think about it. You cram hundreds of thousands, even millions of animals together in extremely stressful, often unhygienic conditions. Disease is basically inevitable. It spreads like wildfire.
Okay.
So to prevent massive die-offs, which would obviously destroy profitability, these operations routinely administer low doses of antibiotics to the animals. Often, it's not even to treat sickness, but just mixed into the feed constantly as a growth promoter or a preventative measure.
So constant low-level exposure for entire populations of animals.
Exactly. And that massive continuous exposure of bacteria to antibiotics is the absolute perfect breeding ground for resistant strains to develop. It's basic evolutionary pressure on a colossal scale.
And these resistant bacteria don't necessarily stay on the farm.
No, they can spread through waste, through water, through workers, through the meat itself. And this crisis becomes truly global, truly terrifying when you look at the potential scale in emerging economies.
Like China and India.
Yeah. Think about this projection. If China and India, with their billion-plus populations each, were to start consuming poultry at the same rate Americans do, which is about 27 or 28 birds per person per year.
Okay.
Just those two countries would consume the entire world's current total production of chickens.
The entire world's current supply, just for two countries matching U.S. consumption.
That's the potential scale. And if the whole world decided to follow America's dietary lead, we could be looking at an annual global consumption of over 165 billion chickens.
The numbers are just incomprehensible.
They really are. And when you consider that kind of scale and the near certainty that antibiotics would be needed to maintain any semblance of health in those incredibly dense populations, the probability of new, dangerous, antibiotic-resistant superbugs emerging and jumping the species barrier to humans, it becomes terrifyingly high, almost a certainty over time.
It really forces a critical question onto the global stage, doesn't it?
It does.
On what date exactly are we collectively willing to accept the loss of effective antibiotics as a basic tool to prevent human suffering and death? Because every burger, every chicken nugget produced this way arguably brings that date a little bit closer.
It's a stark choice.
Uh-huh.
And beyond that huge looming threat of antibiotic resistance, the modern food processing system itself introduces other hidden safety risks.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about known bugs.
Right, most people have heard of E. coli 0157, the hamburger bug.
Yeah, that's the famous one. But the sources we looked at emphasize the problem is much, much wider. Over a dozen new foodborne pathogens have actually been discovered just in the last couple of decades.
New ones, like what?
Things like Campylobacter jejuni, which is now a leading cause of bacterial diarrhea, Cryptosporidium parvum, a nasty parasite, various strains of Listeria monocytogenes. The list goes on.
And why are these emerging now?
It's largely driven by the changes in how we process food. Think about the massive scale of modern slaughterhouses, the incredible speed of the processing lines, the long-distance transport of meat globally. All of these factors increase the opportunities for contamination to spread widely and for pathogens to evolve.
More chances for things to go wrong, basically.
Many more chances. And here's maybe the most concerning statistic of all. This one comes from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Okay.
They estimate that over 75%, three-quarters of all food-related illnesses and deaths in the U.S. are caused by infectious agents that haven't even been identified yet.
75% are caused by unknown pathogens.
Unknown or unidentified infectious agents. It's like this huge black hole in our understanding of food safety, driven by the very complexity and speed of modern food processing. We're seeing major health consequences from things we don't even have names for yet.
All stemming from a system designed for maximum throughput, maximum profit.
With, as we discussed, minimal effective oversight and accountability baked in.
Especially when, as you said, the government can't even mandate a recall of meat known to be dangerous. The political structure seems to be actively enabling these risks.
It certainly seems that way. The lack of accountability is a key part of how the system functions. So when you're faced with all of this, the scale of the suffering, the environmental devastation, the public health risks, the political the natural reaction for a concerned consumer is, okay, what's the alternative? How can I opt out?
Right. You want to find the ethical choice, the humane option?
Of course. But this is where we slam face first into the sobering reality of what our sources call ethical meat scarcity.
Scarcity, meaning there just isn't much of it.
Exactly. We really can't escape the basic math here. The sources lay it out pretty starkly. There simply isn't enough non-factory farm chicken produced in the entire United States right now to feed the population of just Staten Island.
Just Staten Island, one borough of New York City.
That's it for chicken. And for pork. There isn't enough non-factory pork produced in the U.S. to feed the population of New York City as a whole.
Let alone the entire country.
Not even close. And this point is absolutely critical because it completely reframes the potential solution. Ethical meat consumption right now, today, is not a widely available reality for the masses. It's a niche market. It's a luxury good, essentially.
So the conclusion from that scarcity is?
It's pretty stark.
Yeah.
Any consumer who is serious about genuinely reducing their complicity in the factory farming system has to accept that their diet is going to have to involve a lot less meat overall. It means embracing a significant amount of vegetarian or vegan fare. There's just no way around the numbers.
And the scarcity, this lack of real alternatives at scale, it fundamentally challenges that idea of finding a middle ground, doesn't it?
It really does. You know, it's tempting to feel a bit better by maybe buying that expensive pasture-raised steak once in a while when you see it, or when it's convenient.
Right, make yourself feel good that one time.
But then just go back to buying the cheap factory farm chicken breasts or ground beef the rest of the time because it's available and affordable.
Kind of like offsetting your guilt.
Sort of. But the sources we looked at are really uncompromising in rejecting that kind of approach as ineffective if the goal is actually systemic change.
Why?
Because if the goal is to dismantle the CAFO system, then any dollar that continues to flow into that system, even if you try to offset it by spending another dollar on an ethical alternative, is still actively supporting and perpetuating the harmful system.
It keeps the machine running.
Exactly. They offer a really powerful historical analogy in the sources. Think about the Montgomery bus boycott during the Civil Rights Movement. How effective would that boycott have been if the protesters decided to only use the buses, say, on rainy days, or when they felt it was just too inconvenient to walk or carpool?
Yeah. Not very effective at all. It undermines the whole point.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The lesson, according to these sources, is one of moral consistency. A plan that still allows significant amounts of money to flow into the factory farm complex simply won't end factory farming. You can't dismantle the system while simultaneously funding it.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the really difficult issue of cost, the so-called hardship exemption.
Yes, this is the tough economic reality for most people. Food that's produced using more traditional, more humane, more ecologically sound methods, things like certified organic, pasture-raised, regenerative agriculture, it inherently requires more land, more labor, more time.
Which means it costs more, usually significantly more.
Right, so people who are already struggling financially, families on tight budgets, they face an incredibly difficult, often impossible economic choice. The unethical methods persist, in large part precisely because they produce food at a price point that low-income families can actually afford.
So the cheapness itself is what props up the whole architecture of suffering and environmental damage.
In many ways, yes, it creates a trap.
But, okay, let's complicate things a bit. Is the moral calculus entirely settled just by choosing vegetables over meat? Our sources brought up a really fascinating and honestly quite provocative counter-argument.
Ah, yes, the ethical dissonance argument regarding vegetable foods.
Right, the idea that it's maybe inconsistent to condemn the intentional killing of an animal for meat, while completely ignoring the necessary animal killing that underwrites most large-scale vegetable production.
Explain that a bit more. What killing are we talking about?
Well, the argument goes like this. A huge field of corn or soybeans or wheat isn't just cleanly harvested. Growing those crops industrially involves incredibly intensive agricultural practices.
Like tilling, pesticides.
Exactly. Heavy tilling of the soil, widespread use of pesticides and herbicides, the clearing of natural habitats to create those vast monoculture fields. All of these actions result in what the sources call uncountable collateral deaths.
Collateral deaths.
Yeah.
Meaning animals killed unintentionally.
Yes. We're talking about insects, beetles, earthworms killed by pesticides and tillage, field mice, voles, rabbits, ground-nesting birds whose habitats are destroyed or who are killed directly by farm machinery during planting and harvest,
Well.
thousands upon thousands of small animals killed incidentally.
So the argument creates a sort of moral hierarchy.
Kind of. It suggests that maybe animal harvest, where a life like a cow or a pig is intentionally taken for a specific purpose for consumption, is at least part of a planned system. There's labor involved, maybe some form of recompense or use for the whole animal.
Okay.
Whereas these collateral deaths that are inherent in producing, say, the ingredients for a veggie burger or a loaf of bread, those are, in the words of one source, lives plumb wasted. They're killed, incidentally, without direct purpose, just as a side effect of clearing the land for plants.
That definitely complicates the picture. It forces you to rethink what moral eating truly means, beyond just avoiding meat.
Right. If you accept the premise that this massive scale of collateral killing is pretty much unavoidable in our current industrial plant-based food system too,
Right.
how does that change the simple ethical imperative to just avoid meat?
It certainly muddies the waters.
Yeah.
It challenges that easy binary choice. Vegetarian, vegan equals good, carnivore equals bad. The reality seems much messier.
It does. And ultimately, this whole complex web of issues, scale, suffering, environment, economics, ethics, it leads back to a fundamental question about the culture we live in today.
It is.
Is the sheer volume of meat we consume a biological necessity, or is it primarily a cultural choice?
That's a great question. Historically, biologically, there's no doubt. Homo sapiens evolved over millennia with a diet that included, as one source put it, regular binges of carnivory. Eating meat is deep in our evolutionary history. But the modern necessity for mass-produced, incredibly cheap, factory-farmed meat, Consumed at the levels we see today, nearly 90 pounds per person per year in the U.S., that's almost certainly not a biological imperative for survival or health for most people.
It's a demand.
It's a consumer demand, yes. A demand that is actively created, maintained, and defended by corporate secrecy, by sophisticated marketing, by political lobbying, and by that profound lack of transparency we started with. The sheer volume of meat we eat today feels much more like a cultural choice, reinforced by industry rather than a biological need. Hashtag Decatur Dater Toe.
So we've really taken a deep dive today, haven't we? We've tried to trace this long chain of consequences. We started inside the CAFOs in those cramped, stacked cages.
Yeah, seeing the conditions driven by pure efficiency.
Then we followed that thread outwards, looking at the massive corporate consolidation, the political protection these companies enjoy,
The lobbying, the conflicts of interest, the lack of accountability.
and connected it all the way to these huge global crises, things like the dead zones in our oceans, the terrifying rise of antibiotic resistance, the emergence of new and unknown foodborne pathogens.
It really reveals how the true cost of that cheap meat is systematically hidden, how it's systemic, and how devastating it is across multiple levels.
And throughout this, we've kind of seen this recurring theme of convenience, haven't we? How, as a society, we've willingly outsourced so much of our practical knowledge and skills related to food.
Absolutely. Most of us today, we don't need to know how to manage a fire for cooking or how to butcher an animal or how to do complex food preservation beyond maybe freezing something.
Or even just basic cooking from scratch sometimes. We press buttons on microwaves, we order takeout. We trade that hands-on skill and deep knowledge for ease and speed.
We trade it for convenience.
Yeah.
We accept the loss of culinary knowledge in our own kitchens.
Okay, so here's the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. It builds directly on that idea of lost knowledge and outsourced responsibility.
Right.
If we so readily accept the loss of complex culinary knowledge in our kitchens for the sake of convenience, how readily do we, perhaps unknowingly, accept the loss of something far more fundamental? How readily do we accept the destruction of the essential, incredibly fragile ecological foundation that actually supports all of our food, just for that same convenience of cheap meat?
And what is that foundation?
We're talking about the soil itself, not just dirt, but the living soil food web.
The subterranean ecosystem.
Exactly. This incredibly vast, complex, mostly invisible ecosystem that's woven together by literally billions of microbes, bacteria, archaea, miles of mycorrhizal fungi, earthworms, nematodes, this whole intricate web of life beneath our feet.
And this living system, it's not just incidental, it's the actual foundation of healthy terrestrial life, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Healthy soil, which is alive with this web, is fundamentally different from dirt. It does amazing things. Our sources point out it can store incredible amounts of water, whole rivers and lakes worth held within the earth. It acts as a massive carbon sink, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. It cycles nutrients, making them available to plants naturally. It underpins everything.
Okay, but how does this connect back to the cheap meat model?
Well, the very practices that make industrial agriculture, and therefore cheap factory-farmed meat, possible, things like intensive deep tilling of the soil year after year, the fumigation with chemicals, the massive reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides.
All those industrial inputs we discussed.
Yes, those practices actively destroy that intricate soil food web. Tilling breaks up the fungal networks. Chemicals kill the beneficial microbes along with the pests. Synthetic fertilizers short-circuit natural nutrient cycling. We're essentially sterilizing the soil, killing the life within it.
Leading to erosion, nutrient loss, massive water runoff, carrying pollutants.
Exactly. We degrade the very foundation. So the final question is this. When you truly recognize the immense complexity, the incredible importance, and the alarming fragility of this invisible living system that ultimately supports every single thing you eat, whether that's an ethically raised steak or a conventionally grown vegetable that involved collateral killing or anything in between, what responsibility does that knowledge place on you?
How does that understanding influence where you choose to put your money, what kind of food system you choose to support with your purchases?
Is the sheer convenience and cheapness of industrially produced food, especially meat, worth the ongoing destruction of the ecological foundation that makes all future food possible?
That's a heavy question to ponder.
It is, and that's where we'll leave it for this deep dive. Thanks for tuning in.